Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 502 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, February the 21st, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Pittampalli. I'm the author of Persuadable, and I help leaders adapt to a fast-changing world.
I'm really happy we're connecting, Al. It's been forever.
Yeah, it has been forever, actually. I remember our last conversation went great, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Right, we were talking about your last book, which is still a book that I think you see this on Facebook. I'm constantly referring people like, I need a good book about how to run meetings. I'm like, there is only one good book, and it's Al's, right?
Yes, thank you for the support. I really appreciate it.
Which is, the book was called Read This Before Your Next Meeting.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, and again, it's one of those things where I saw that you had this brand new book coming out called Persuadable, How Great Leaders Change Their Minds to Change the World. And I took the book and I hit myself in the head. I'm like, why do I wait for someone to have a new book to have them on the show? Because we had some really fun and dynamic conversations. But listen, never judge a book by its cover. Let's do this. Let's judge a book by its cover. It's a great title. And I don't know what it was about, whether it was the title of the book or the cover or the subtitle, but it really struck a chord with me because the second I saw it, I thought, wow, it's true. Like, if you go into an office as a leader and say, I've changed my mind completely, there's very few people who stand up and applaud you. It's usually quite the opposite, where we think that this is a total weakness or you're being influenced and you're not really showing this sort of clear and present thing of leadership. And in going through beyond the title into the book, I realized as someone who some might consider a leader that I'm actually quite persuadable, and I never even was able to self-acknowledge it.
Yeah, I think that is one of the primary goals of my book, is to give people permission to change their mind, and to be proud of it and to do it intentionally and powerfully. And I think that, people, at least a lot of people, at least the more open-minded crowd, know that intellectually that it's often a good idea to change your mind, to update your beliefs with new evidence. But I think that there was lacking a manifesto that really articulated, why don't we change our mind? What is the perceptions of changing our mind? And what are the advantages to changing our mind? Because it's really by understanding the advantages that we can say, you know what, there may be some perception costs here, but the advantages are so extraordinary that we can't pass up on this opportunity to do it, because it's just too great.
So before we talk about the sausage that is the content of this book, let's go a bit back and talk about the sausage factory and how this came to be. You do a book on meetings. You are a known business consultant, New York City dude, always putting interesting content out there. I've been following you for a long time. You see a lot of things. You hear a lot of things. There are, I guess, edges of interest in your world. What's the thing that makes you go, wait a second, changing your mind, this is a good thing, and I have a book?
Well, there was a couple things, but, the origin was I started trying to write the sequel to what was The Modern Meeting. And I thought that the next obvious book to write would be The Modern Team. And so what I did was I really spent a lot of time really looking at modern teams. Like, what does teamwork look like in a fundamentally new world that we live in? And the more I researched these teams, I realized that these leaders, at least the most successful companies, the most successful leaders that are just really agile and really just kind of innovative, they have these leaders that just don't look like leaders that I recognize from kind of the stereotypical way that I look at leadership. And what I realized was that they were persuadable. There was this certain personality trait that they had, these cognitive habits that they had that just made them very distinct. And at that point, I realized that, first of all, I need to be persuadable myself and drop this idea of the modern team, because this is really a book about leadership. And I realized that this key ingredient of being persuadable is the ultimate leadership advantage in a world that's changing faster than ever. And then the book just kind of wrote itself. I mean, it took 3 years, but over those 3 years, it kind of wrote itself.
But was it like a cumulative effect, or was it like it's sort of brewing underneath it, and then you saw this one leader and you were like, oh, that's like, did you have a light bulb, or was it more like,
One of the light bulb moments was when I read one of the accounts of the raid to get Osama bin Laden. And I can't remember which. I think it was Peter Bergen's book, which is Manhunt. There was two great books, but I think it was Peter Bergen's book that really got to me. Where I'm reading this book, and I knew something about the raid. Obviously, you see it in the movies and you see it on CNN, but I didn't know. The man who oversaw the raid to get Osama bin Laden, but was a man by the name of Admiral William McRaven. And when you're reading the account of Admiral William McRaven, I was just shocked. I was shocked because when you think about what the leader, if in your mind you just close your eyes and you say, what do you think the leader of the raid to get Osama bin Laden is like? You would probably think the three C's of what I call the traditional leadership archetype, that this guy is like convicted, he's super confident, and he's super consistent. Like he says
barrel
what he means
chested and loud?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And this guy was almost exactly the opposite. I mean, this guy was admittedly abhorred conviction. He was almost paranoid about being overconfident. And he also knew that often he would be inconsistent. And when I noticed that, I'm like, wait a minute, what is going on here? This, in the world of the military, where you most think that leaders are that we most have this kind of association with what strong leadership is,
And they're like
and now
Xeroxed in that system.
exactly, and now my views are clashing. I mean, there's this conflict in my mind that I needed to explore that. So that was really one of the light bulb moments that I was like, let me look at some of the very best leaders across different industries, and let me see what they're like in order to test this. So I looked at leaders like Jeff Bezos, of obviously the CEO of Amazon, for business, and I looked at Ray Dalio in finance. And across the board, the more leaders I was looking at, the more I saw that they all had this unusual willingness to change their mind. And at that point, it really became kind of obvious that somebody needs to write a book about this.
But is there the other side of this, which is the ones that don't are the ones that are dying? You know what I mean? Like it's sort of like we have this perception, but the truth is that that perception is actually the ones who are suffering the most, and that the most agile have this component to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that nowadays the leaders who are succeeding are persuadable, and the leaders who are falling by the wayside are unpersuadable. They are stubborn in their beliefs. Now, that being said, it's kind of confusing often because like the way biographies are written, even if you have somebody who's mentally agile, who's persuadable, who's kind of willing to change their mind and really radically open-minded, the way that biographies are written, the way that movies are portrayed, that guy still seems like he's this convicted, confident, consistent leader, right? It kind of they often hide that trait because that's not the way we look at leadership. I mean, a great example of this is Abraham Lincoln. If you look at his actual biographies, if you look at exactly what happened, his views changed time and time again on slavery. In fact, some people would be shocked at some of his views and how they kind of contradicted themselves over time and how he changed. But when you look, because he was a persuadable leader, I actually think that that was a positive attribute. I think his ability to grow as a leader was what really made him such a remarkable president. But look at the movie, the Oscar-winning movie Lincoln. You don't see that at all. You see a very consistent leader who's highly decisive, who basically just has this kind of straight and narrow path and follows it. So I think that there's this real perception that in some ways some of the best leaders have always been persuadable, and yet we just haven't realized it.
Now, yet, as we say this, and as it seems so, I think the greatest works are ones where they come out and they seem obvious to us. And I think you've really captured that with Persuadable. But the other side of it is that we talk about, well, we're agents of change and we like change. And the story I often tell people when I'm speaking is, we say we want like change, but if I showed up in your house before you woke up every day and moved your coffee maker, by the third day, you'd like be screaming bloody murder. Like, we actually don't like change. We do like consistency. We do like knowing where things are. So there is this sort of strange dichotomy where we see this within these great leaders and it feels somewhat obvious, but the truth is most of us really don't like change. We talk about it. I think we give it good platitudes, but we really don't want to change. We're set in our ways.
Right. And there's probably good reason for that too, right? Because we
Keeps
just
us
don't
safe. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we don't have the cognitive bandwidth to change absolutely everything, right? I mean, if we human beings crave certainty, and for good reason, because we do need a sufficient amount of certainty, right? Like if every time you walked in walked to your door and the doorknob was different, right, and you had to figure out a new way to open it, you would freak out, right? I mean, we just don't have the time and energy to continually change everything. So there's the part of us that benefits from being decisive, using what Daniel Kahneman calls our System 1 intuition, relying on our gut and just going through the world and relying on these habits that we have ingrained. That's fine. But truly successful people really make a conscious choice of knowing when we shouldn't be relying on that stuff. Like for the most important stuff, for the big decisions, for the things that are high stakes, those are the things that a good enough decision is not good enough, right? We need a really great decision. We need to put our best on, and we need to really do great work and really figure out like what exactly is the best path. And for those kinds of matters, it's really important that we're persuadable.
So, what's your advice to prime the pump? Let's say I look at the book and I go, of course, I feel myself somewhat on the fence about this. I believe in that sort of archetype liability of leadership revolving around confidence, consistency, and conviction. But I believe you, Al, and I want to do that. Are there things that I can do as a leader to open the door a little crack to being more persuadable that you've seen people do where you're like, yeah, that's the sort of, this is like one of the two in your 12 step?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important moments for all of the persuadable leaders that I've talked to, some of the most successful, what I call persuadables, is they all have can point to what I call a moment of opacity. So a moment of clarity, we all know what that is, right? It's like a moment of realization that some experience happened to you, and at that moment, it's almost as if like the entire world just became so obvious to you. Like it's like you understood everything the way that the world is. Well, I talk about how for a lot of people there's an experience that's the exact opposite, where you feel like you understand the world so much, right? Like you really, everything is so clear to you, and then something happens to you that you're like, whoa, I was totally wrong about that. And in that moment, you have this moment of opacity. You realize, wow, the world is more complex and uncertain than I believed. Now, the problem is, that's a really beautiful and enlightening moment. But the problem is 5 minutes later, we forget it. And then we just continue to go around basically assuming that we understand the world. The best persuadable leaders identify that moment of opacity, and then they remind themselves of it often, right? Like I even give people an exercise. So I say, think about a time where you were so sure you were going to get something right, and then it came out wrong, right? Like you were so sure that the Yankees were going to win, the World Series, and they ended up didn't winning it, right? Write that down on an index card and carry it around in your pocket. And then, over the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, just every time you get this, what Robert Burton calls this feeling of knowing, this feeling that of intuition, this sense that like you just understand things and you kind of know the truth about things, pull out that index card and remind yourself that our intuition is often unreliable. That feeling of knowing can often lead us astray. And that is the first step to kind of opening the door to being persuadable, because really that first ingredient is humility.
And so to dig a little bit deeper into that idea of humility, because I think there's like I love the word, because I'll often meet people and they say, I'm very humble and I live in this world of humility, and I look at the archetype and I'm like, don't think so. I really don't think that. Like I think it's almost like one of those things where if you are it, you don't sort of talk about it, right?
Yeah, and I think that,
It's like the Anderson consultant using the integrity thing.
exactly. That's exactly right. And like humility may not even be the right word. I wish there was a better one, at least that I knew, because really what we're talking about, I think the most practical way to think about this is it's the kind of practice of distrusting your gut. It's amazing how often we're giving the advice in our culture that we should trust our gut, right? It's like this feeling that this intuition that we have is right or is true, and we should just trust it. And that's really bad advice because our intuition is often really leads us astray. It's everything that science has taught us in the last 30 years has shown us that there's nothing magical about intuition. It can be often wrong. And so what we need to do is really need to develop a distrust in our intuition. We have to, as Robert Burton, who again is a great neurophilosopher, says, this intuition, this feeling of knowing that comes up, we don't consciously choose it, right? We want to believe that, oh, we've evaluated the reasons, we have really good reasons for feeling like that we're right on something, but actually, this feeling of knowing operates in the brain independent of reason. It actually happens to us just like we fall in love, right? Nobody chooses to fall in love, it just happens to you. And so what we have to do is we have to make sure that we're always the way we relate to that feeling of knowing is one of distrust, where we say, listen, that feeling of knowing is telling us something, our intuition, our gut is telling us something, but it may not be right. And that is what humility is all about. It's a different way of relating to your intuition than most people do.
So, I mean, that's like I feel like we had a hard hill to hump on the whole humility thing. That one sounds even like more terrifying to me because people are going to go into this and you want to assume at one point you definitely want to second guess yourself, but you don't want to second guess yourself into analysis paralysis. And as human beings, I don't think we're really great at figuring out where that line is crossed.
I think that's a really good point, and that's why this is kind of an art as much as it's a science, because there are people that swing way too far on the other end of the spectrum, right? They constantly second guess themselves, and they don't know when to be decisive, and they don't know when to just terminate evaluation and just make a decision, and that's kind of the ball game here. I mean, it's really this achieving this balance, and it's actually something that some of the best leaders in the world really have a challenge with. Like Ray Dalio is a perfect example. Ray Dalio, who's arguably the most successful hedge fund investor in the world, he runs Bridgewater Investments. He is admittedly kind of almost paranoid about being overconfident. When he gets too confident, he really has to kind of keep himself in check, and that paranoia can be really taxing and kind of unhealthy. But he knows it's his greatest competitive advantage, and so he's willing to deal with that uncertainty. And kind of engage in it because he knows that it gives him a clearer sense of the world. And yes, does it go too far sometimes? Yes, but I think it's better to be a little bit more persuadable than it is to be too over decisive.
Okay, so if we swing to the other side on this, so we agree it's important. We need to be persuadable, and that's great. My immediate thought was, well, who is best to persuade us? And the reason I say that is I work in an industry ad agency, marketing agency, where there's two trains of thought. One train of thought is, our business and our IP leaves the office every day at 5 o'clock down the elevator. It's our people. There's another train of thought that says, yeah, but these people will jump to any other agency for a raise if it's a different type of client and it's a bit incestuous and they sort of, so it's really about the leadership and how they create the vision and type of brand the agency is, and that's the differentiation. And, it's a debate that's been going on forever.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were to think about, so who is the right person? Like, how am I as a leader able to self-assess that the person who I'm allowing me to be persuadable to is credible?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I guess it depends. But I mean, let's first kind of dispense with an obvious straw man, which is that persuadable doesn't mean always persuaded, nor does it mean gullible. So you could trust, I mean, it has way more to do with the value of the message than it is the value of the messenger, or the credibility of the message versus the credibility of the messenger. So you could have an intern or your worst enemy give you some feedback, and if the feedback is true or if the feedback is good, you should be able to accept it. Versus even if the smartest person in the world gives you feedback and it's the wrong feedback, you need to try to evaluate the feedback independent of the messenger. So does the messenger give you a clue as to whether or not you should trust the feedback? Yes, but it's a shortcut, right? When we have sufficient time, we should try to dissociate ourselves from the actual messenger and really focus on the message.
Hmm. Now, is it one of those things too where you're building the team around you in order to give them the power to influence the outcome, or is it where the leader is simply there as a figurehead who's almost like checking and balancing the leadership you put in place? Because there's also that component of it too. There's a lot of leaders who are not, I wouldn't say figureheads, but they really do. They sort of just, make sure that budgets are in play and things are running smoothly and overall are there to be some sort of macro mentor.
Right, right. I mean, I think that I'm a big fan of one decision maker per decision, right? One person, a decision owner, I should say, right? Somebody who's ultimately accountable for the decision being made. Okay. Now, a lot of people kind of confuse a decision with a decision making process, right?
Mm.
Like every decision has a decision making process wherein like I could be the decision maker, but my decision making process is maybe, okay, first, why don't I get 5 people's feedback, right? And then second, why don't I get 3 people and we'll all evaluate the feedback together. But the third step or the last step is always you're the one who's making the decision, right? You're the one who's ultimately deciding how this decision gets made. And as long as you really kind of approach it that way, then this idea of like, who do I ask feedback? Who do I get feedback for? Or how do I do that? Is secondary, and it's informed by what kind of decision needs to be made.
Do you think that being persuadable has a component to it where if it's deployed well and people think about it in a real powerful way, and I think the way you defined it in the book is beautiful, right? There's the humanity component of it, the inconsistency of it, and the radical open-mindedness of it, that if you do this, your fear of making mistakes actually doesn't go away, but it sort of gets diminished and buffered because you're in a different flow of seeing things as either the way I establish them versus that's a mistake, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is most people
It's like a
see.
gateway drug.
Right, right. Because I think the people who are the most successful at this treat their beliefs as temporary, right?
Yeah.
And when you treat your beliefs as temporary and they don't have a chance to solidify in your mind, it's way less painful when you actually have to change it, right? Like the people who get, and this is a problem for everyone, right? We all get very, especially in our domains of expertise, we all just kind of think that we're great, right? We think that we're either great marketers or we're great athletes or we're great physicians, whatever. And as soon as you hold on to that belief and you want to make it permanent, then of course, when somebody gives you feedback that threatens that belief, it's going to be really hard for you, right? But people who are really truly persuadable often are really good at really treating those beliefs as temporary, like really trying to make sure that they're never relating to those beliefs as permanent, right? It's what Carol Dweck calls the growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. It's constantly realizing that we're fluid creatures and things are going to change, and if we prepare for it in advance, if we mentally prepare for it, then when we make a mistake or then when we need to change our mind or then when we're proven wrong, it's not as bad as if we kind of had treated it permanently.
Is there a sense of volatility to this? And what I mean is, again, I always read books and I'm like, yeah, like you're fist bumping and going, this is totally what I believe. And there's this new generation of people who've like been influenced by new business thinkers. You and I definitely have a strong connection with Seth Godin.
Mm-hmm.
And the other side of that is I often find myself being in the position I'm in to be like, and then we have Wall Street. It's like this weird sort of conversation where Wall Street isn't forgiving. Wall Street is looking minute by minute. They're looking quarter by quarter. And the ability to create any sense of volatility can create really, really dangerous ramifications in the organization, even if you're in that sort of strength growth or that sort of flow of what persuadable means. There's still a negative connotation to it.
So negative connotation towards the actual volatility.
Well, I think if a boss came out and said, I read this great book by Al and it's called Persuadable and I'm going to, move in this direction. Like, I think there might be a sort of perspective of, ooh, like this sounds like it could be volatile and that would affect the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I wish that I could say that my idea was just this breakthrough kind of
Honestly,
like
yeah.
crazy new idea that it's just not though. I mean, the thesis of my book essentially is that we should have a mindset that allows the best idea to prevail. I mean, this is really almost a content-free book. I'm not pushing any particular
Don't sell it so
idea.
hard, Al.
But really though, baby, I'm setting the
Really don't
rules.
read those, yeah.
I'm not really participating in the debate. I'm setting the rules for the debate. I'm saying, what if we as citizens, as voters, as employees, as decision makers and executives came to every single interaction, came to the table and said, let's approach this idea with intellectual honesty and let's try to make sure the best idea prevails.
But do you
Now,
think the people at Wall Street would concur with that? Are they like, don't be so granola, dude? Like, you and Mitch need to go, sip mojitos somewhere and let the big boys play.
I mean, I would hope they would. I mean, being persuadable, there's a lot of resistance to being persuadable, right? Because it takes, there's this great quote by Upton Sinclair, which is, it's impossible to make a man understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it.
Right.
And
Exactly.
in the short term, being persuadable threatens a lot of short term interest, right? It's like the old, I always talk about the writing expression "kill your darlings," which is one of the chapters of the book, right?
Yeah, it's
Like
one of your 7 practices of how to get to persuadable. Yeah.
exactly, and like if you're a writer, and your editor wants to take away one of your sentences, which is one of your babies, you're going to resist, right? Because you like that sentence, and you know that if they take away the sentence in the short term, it's going to be painful, and you're going to have to think of a new sentence. You're going to have to restructure it or all this stuff. And so that's why it's hard being persuadable, especially when it comes to things that are deeply important to us. I mean, and we're talking about sentences. I mean, think about political positions or, moral beliefs. I mean, these can be really painful stuff. But the whole point is if we're willing to tolerate some of that short-term pain and that sacrifice, the gains in the long term are extraordinary, right? And listen, this is the human condition, right? We've always been in a position where we're tempted to not want to take the short-term losses and instead have the immediate pleasure of gratification, even if we're sacrificing the long-term potential. So this is not a new resistance that you'll see from Wall Street or any faction for that matter. But I'm just really making the argument that the payoff is so great, it's so big that it's worth some of the short-term pain.
Do you look at how leaders are acting today in terms of their performance within the model you're talking about in Persuadable? Like, do you see leaders differently now that it's done, it's out in the world, and like how persuadable are these people, or is it one of those things where it's almost like one of many things in a checklist of what you're looking at?
Well, I mean, now I'm biased, right? Because I spent three years, and I've classified this as the ultimate leadership advantage. So that's the prism through which I see everything. So I admittedly am biased in that way. But here's the thing: it's very hard, and it was a challenge of the book to determine whether somebody is being persuadable or not, right? Because it's persuadable is something that happens inside your head. We have all these unconscious biases that make it so that we don't even know. I don't even know often when I'm being persuadable. So the challenge is, how can we really identify, or at least try to identify, the biases that are operating within us so we can make better decisions, so we can be really intellectually honest and objective when evaluating evidence, so we can determine whether we should invest in this product or that product, whether we should go in this direction or that direction. And so when I see leaders who are asking questions, who are surrounding themselves with intelligent people who are willing to disagree with them, those are the behaviors that I know are clues that this leader is being persuadable, but I can't tell for sure. But I think that those clues are important to making sure that people are getting the right kind of challenging for their thinking.
Isn't this the reason we create a board of directors to have that persuadable component be a part of how we conduct ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's great. There's always been great ways of structuring teams and organizations that are smart, right? The U.S. Constitution was really smart because they divided the government to three houses that have this conflict, this inherent conflict and tension with each other, and there's all these different, and in organizations they have an internal audit department that is conflicts with and challenges the mainstream organization. So there's all this tension that is good. And what I'm doing is I think hopefully I'm giving a name to it so people can really recreate this, because although it happens often at a structural level, an organizational level, it doesn't happen on an individual level, right? Like, when's the last time we red teamed ourselves? Right? Like, when's the last time we actually really intelligently sought out people to for the sole purpose of disagreeing with us and kind of creating conflict with ourselves? That's the kind of behavior that I'm trying to create more often in leadership.
So there's this idea of I could be wrong, and it's something you bring forward in your content. I think it's something that anybody who has any semblance of leadership is probably the last thing you say to yourself if you can even close your eyes in the darkest of dark nights, right? Like,
Right.
I think it's a natural human instinct to look, interesting and profound and leadership alike, but then you go home and it's dark and you're in bed and you're thinking about your day going like, what if I'm wrong? I mean, these are like real human emotions. Is the book an amplification or a recognition of that, an acceptance of it? Have you thought about the implications of exasperating that thought? Because I don't know many people who want to like, oh, let me angst that up a little bit for me because I need more stress in my life.
I think instead of an amplification, it's a kind of owning of that question, right? Like, it's a real, like, I feel like that often happens often to us. It's kind of like something that overtakes us instead of us deploying it as a kind of a tool, right? I mean, Gary Klein has now has this famous technique called the pre-mortem, which is before something goes wrong, you kind of like envision the scenario in which it might go wrong and then kind of come up with the reasons for what that is. And that's the kind of thinking that I'm thinking about. Often we make a decision and then we kind of worry about it when it's already too late, right? We've already made the decision. I'm talking about what if we went through that process of agonizing, and it can be agonizing, it can be painful, but what if we did it more before the decision and in public with your team where they can challenge you and help you determine whether these are real reasons or whether you're just being crazy and paranoid.
But that's where you have to have. But that's where you have to have really good team members, because you don't want people going like, I don't want to work for this guy. He's indecisive. He's not sure. He's very, very. He can be swayed one way or the other. I mean, there are components in that I think, as a leader, are judgmental and are things that would make me nervous, because you want to have a team that obviously feels engaged and interact, but you also don't want them to feel like it's rudderless.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why I really think that this balance between knowing when to be decisive and when to be persuadable is huge. I mean, again, you don't want somebody who's too persuadable that borders on indecisive, right? If every 2 seconds the leader's changing their mind, that's going to get people worried, right? Because people rightly want certainty. But I just think that most of the time, leaders are really far. They're too far in the on the decisive end of the spectrum. They're really not persuadable. And by the way, we often mistake lacking confidence as like a kind of a sign of weakness or a sign of like a lack of strength for that matter. And Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winning researcher, who I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. I want everyone to watch an interview with Daniel Kahneman. He's like one of the smartest people in the world. I mean, this is inarguable. I want you to see how many times that guy, when he's asked an interview question, he will literally say things like, I don't know the answer to that. Or he'll literally say something like, that question is too hard for me. And nobody in that room looks at him as he's weak, right? He looks like a leader. The presence, the body language, he knows what he knows, and he he knows what he doesn't know.
He's got some good social proofing though too, right? Like he's
Well,
got the artillery to be able to do that. Some people don't, Nobel Prize and whatever.
but I don't think that that's what's necessary. Is kind of one of the points I'm
Okay.
making. It's like I think like the person that comes into a meeting, and if they're really insecure and they really don't feel like they know something, and they're kind of sinking in their chair, and they're nervous because they feel like it's a weakness to admit that they don't know something. That's different than the person that comes in the meeting and just confidently with the kind of with poise and says, you know what, A, B, and C are kind of unknown to us at this point, and we're going to have to make a decision that recognizes that. There's no difference in the content of those two things. What's different is just that the second person gave themselves permission. They understood that lacking confidence is not a weakness if you do it intelligently and you do it intentionally. And that's why I think that for leaders, I'm hoping that this book empowers them. It empowers them to realize that you don't have to slunk in your chair and act nervous and feel weak when you're admitting that you don't have all the answers. If you do it with powerfully, you realize that it can actually be really viewed by your team as a leadership strength.
So you mentioned Daniel, and obviously he's considered one of the godfathers of behavioral economics. I know that you have a deep respect for people like Dan Ariely, another mutual friend of ours.
Right.
There is a component in your work of behavioral economics. You talk a lot about cognitive and social psychology. Are you as fascinated as I am about how these types of sciences have, one, grown in tremendous popularity, like almost to be like sort of like mass media culture, the type of stuff you'd buy at like a Spencer's almost. And on the other side of it, how far we've come, and yet I think how far we still have to go to really see how amazing this stuff could be for business performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the kind of the impetus for the book is I felt like, I mean, isn't it crazy that, this best-selling book that's called Predictably Irrational, that's literally just going out and calling human beings, the reader, irrational? I mean, to think that by calling the reader irrational, you would have a bestseller is kind of crazy. But that is kind of the time we are in right now. Like, people just seem to be fascinated with this idea that we are flawed. I mean, we have these cognitive deficiencies, we have these biases, and I think that's great. I think as a culture, the fact that we're embracing this and fascinated by it is a really, really great thing. And that's why I think that we there's hopefully a place for my book on the shelves, because again, it's one of those books that really is based in this humility that, listen, there is that we have some problems, we have some thinking problems, and now the research is getting to the point where we can actually do something about it, right? Like, there's really some great knowledge and research about, because for a long time it was just like, all right, we're irrational, it's kind of a terrible thing, but what are you going to do, But now, as the research is evolving, we're starting to realize there are things that we can do, and that I think I'm even more excited about than the previous research is the research that is going into, okay, how do we train ourselves out of this? How do we really kind of de-bias ourselves? And that's what I think is like kind of the new frontier.
So you spent 3 years working on this book, thinking about it, pulling it together, and the book comes out in a really precarious time. I mean, the global economy is in a very, very scary state. I think that the frailty of business and all of those things is really becoming magnified to like the average person. Like, they're able to see that like there is a frailty here, and the markets are colliding and reacting in crazy, crazy ways. And oil, is it China? Is it presidential elections? I mean, some people say they know. I think there's a whole bunch of reasons to this, but there's this intersection of your book coming out and where things are at in business. And I would say that where we're sitting right now, this conversation that you and I are having, people are really, really scared about a business's ability to grow and do these things. And I feel, as at least an agency guy who's got more of a global perspective because of the nature of my agencies, which is 20 plus countries now, that there's this apprehension and almost a return to like head down sales, get the work done, and that some of this stuff that we're all excited about maybe has to take a back seat as we try and figure out what this world looks like. Are you feeling that sort of like, I'm putting a book out at a time when people really want to make sure that they're going to have money in their bank account next week?
Well, I think that that may be a valid concern. I don't know. I mean, what I do know is that, in times of change, there is often the threat and then there's the opportunity. And this book, obviously, my bias has always been, let's figure out the opportunity. And I think that there will always be the majority of people who kind of are afraid of the change and are resistant and kind of shrink. But I'm hoping that this book is really for the people who are willing to look change really hard in the eye and say, okay, I know change is coming, so what can we do about it? Because the big theme of the book is that, a lot of people kind of at least look at the book and they say, oh, okay, I need to be open-minded. Great, I kind of knew that already. And they're missing the point. We're not talking about being open-minded. Open-mindedness is not enough. What we're talking about is being actively
You
open-minded.
better be open-minded. I mean, I'm going to be very closed-minded in the office today.
Exactly. But we're talking about what Jonathan Barron calls actively open-minded, which that means not just kind of passively, like waiting for evidence to come to change your mind. It's about being on the edge of your seat and actually trying to prove yourself wrong. It's actually going out there and actually trying to prove your disfavored beliefs, to kill your darlings, right? In the presence of change, we kind of just wait. Look at the social media revolution, right? Like, how many executives were kind of like, I know a lot of executives during the whole social media revolution, which we're still going through, and I didn't know a lot of close-minded executives. I feel like that was a straw man. Like, I didn't know anyone that was just basically putting their head in the sand and saying, all right, I totally understand that social media has no value, has no purpose. No, they were kind of like generally open-minded. They're like, yeah, no, I know. There's probably this thing called Twitter. There's probably this thing
No,
called Facebook.
but they did have to be dragged into a kicking or screaming. It's not like they embraced it and were proactive in the sense of, wow, this is really great that I can have all these people complaining in public. Like, I mean, I really was on the ground floor of this, and I can tell you there was very few companies. Dell was one of them that was really proactive, but most of them were really apprehensive and sort of maybe not sitting out, but we're wishing it might just go away a little bit.
And that may be a fair point, and maybe I should be persuadable to that, because there's certainly a number of the executives that were closed-minded, but next to them there were executives that were open-minded. They were generally open-minded. They weren't as apprehensive as maybe the folks that you were talking about,
Right.
but they also weren't in a hurry to get this to change, right? They were kind of like, all right, let's wait and see, let's wait for the right opportunity to kind of like throw all of our chips behind this. But then there were the actively open-minded folks, the folks that were like, listen, even though that this is threatening, and even though this is scary, and even though that this might undermine part of the way we're doing things right now, we're going to go out there and really, we're going to kill our darlings. We're really going to go out there and we're going to find the evidence ourselves. And if this thing is true, then we want to know about it. And so they really hired the right people. They really read the right stuff, and they really got behind the revolution before others. And they had the kind of the first mover advantage. So in the presence of change, the point here, the lesson here, it's not good enough to be open-minded. Certainly you shouldn't be closed-minded, but it's not even enough to be open-minded, because all the rewards disproportionately go to the folks that are actively open-minded.
Yeah, whenever someone goes into a similar diatribe about that, I'm always reminded of this quote that I saw in Tom Peters' book Reimagine. It's from this General Shinseki, retired U.S. Army, and he said, "If you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less." And I always love that quote. The last sort of thing I'd be curious about is when we think of great leaders, I think our generation, I'm lumping you and I together because I think we're of similar age and ilk, I think our great leader of our generation was Steve Jobs. Would you think he was a persuadable?
It's funny you say that, because somebody had just mentioned to me that in that I forget who wrote that, Creativity Inc. I think it was the CEO
David
of
Burkus.
Pixar.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you're right. Ed Catmull, I think.
Ed Catmull,
yeah,
and this is all, I just learned this secondhand from someone else. The book is on its way, but somebody was telling me that he was a good friend of Steve Jobs and he had worked with him, and he says that Steve Jobs didn't get enough credit because the lore behind him is that he was this closed-minded, kind of stubborn guy, and he wanted things his way, and he kind of was. But at the same point, when somebody would was courageous enough to call him out or to tell him that he was wrong or to present an idea that was clearly better than his, he would change his mind pretty instantaneously. And I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't read the book, but that sounds like the right capacity because, people who are innovative, who are really doing this great work, I find a lot of them tend to be very persuadable, and I wouldn't be surprised if Steve Jobs, in that capacity, was himself.
Yeah, and the reason I think you're spot on, I have read the book, but never knew the guy, obviously. I think that people who are successful because of deep inspiration probably can self-recognize that inspiration comes from a lot of influences in other areas, and that is a fundamental value of being persuadable, right? It's like I've seen all these different things, and it's persuading me into a direction of choice.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other kind of misperception about what being persuadable is. It's like the most persuadable people are often not very nice people. I mean, it's not like they're just they happily change their mind or they just treat everyone with, like kind of butterflies and roses. No, they're just a lot of times they're just these super rational kind of calculated people that they know that in order to really understand the world better than other people, to have that kind of competitive advantage, they need to be willing to admit when somebody's idea is better than theirs, or if a certain proposition is truer than the one in their brain right now.
Or augments even. It doesn't have to be better. It could just augment or add on or bolt onto it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that realization can be done grudgingly. It can be done quickly, but you don't necessarily have to be nice about it. It's great if you are. I think that's the ideal thing. But don't kind of mistake being persuadable for being a pushover or somebody who's just so humble that they're always kind of conceding. These people really, the best way to do it is to really evaluate things objectively and open-minded.
All right. So the lesson we learned here today is don't listen to Al. His book is called Persuadable, and it is not content free. There's a ton of fun value and smarts in this. And I happen to be a huge fan of this genre, and I actually think there's a new genre happening in the business book world, which is these types of books that really sort of blend that idea of behavioral economics and new ways of thinking, or as I like to call this, I think your book is like the ultimate George Costanza book too. They do the opposite. Like, what do you think? And see, plan it out in a lot more strategic way. I'll let people know where they can best connect to your stuff.
Yeah, alpitt.com, alpitt.com. You can actually download the first chapter of the book for free. I would totally do that.